Perfect. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Hopefully you're all having good days so far. Um, and so I know most of you guys are master naturalists. Some of you guys are game and parks or other organizations. Um, I know this is my first year on the project. I came out from Massachusetts. I came out here to University of Nebraska for my master's degree. And then, so this is my first year on this project, but I know some of you have assisted on this project in prior years. Other of you haven't or have various levels with our experience operating the equipment we use. So I thought I would just talk about a little bit about bats and the whole North American bat monitoring program as a whole, and then focus on what we're trying to do here in Nebraska and some of the sampling techniques that we use. I'll talk about bat acoustics and the equipment that we use to gather that data, which is mostly what this project revolves around. So bats are cool because they are the only mammal capable of self-powered flight. And there are over 1,200 species of bats all over the world. You can find them on every continent except Antarctica. And different bats, depending on where you find them, will eat different kinds of animals. So most of the bats here eat insects, but there are bats in other parts of the world that feed on nectar, so they pollinate flowers. Others eat fruit and spread the seeds. And then other bats eat a variety of small animals, fish, lizards, small birds, even other bats. And so here in North America, we have 32 different species of bat, and all of them, or most of them, are insectivorous. And then of those 32 species, we have 13 here that occur in Nebraska. And so bats nowadays face a variety of different threats. Chief among them is a fungal disease that causes white nose syndrome. And so this pathogen was first found in a cave in New York back in 2006. And since then, it's spread throughout Canada and much of the eastern US. It's also made the jump to Washington State and California. And so this fungus, it likes the cool, moist climate of caves. And so it affects bats that hibernate in caves the most. And it shows up predominantly as a kind of a white fluff on their muzzle area. So that's how they coined the term white nose syndrome. And bats like to keep themselves really clean. And so what happens during the winter time is this fungus starts growing on them, and they get irritated and they wake up a lot, and they use up their fat reserves and all that energy they stored up to hibernate in the winter. And they use that up a lot faster than they normally would. This disease also dissolves bat tissue in their wings, so then they're not really able to fly if they have a severe case of white nose syndrome. And so lots of bats, several species have been hit very hard, and some cave hibernacula have experienced greater than 90% mortality in some of these caves. And so that's one of the chief threats that a lot of bats face today. Another is wind energy. So no one really knows why a lot of bats get hit by turbines, but these turbines affect high-flying, migrating bats the most. And about 1 million bats are killed each year by these wind turbines. So all the bats here in Nebraska and that occur throughout much of the United States, they use something called echolocation when they're flying around at night. So bats aren't blind. A lot of people think that bats are blind as a bat. I don't really know how that term came to be, but Bats have pretty good eyesight. They can see at least just as well as we can, but it's hard to see at night. And so these bats, they use really high frequency sounds that basically operate as sonar. So they emit these high frequency sounds, they bounce off their environment, and then they come back to the bats, and they're able to sort of map their environment that way. And that's how they're able to fly around, avoid obstacles, talk to other bats, and catch insects and other prey. So these are the different species of bats that you can find here in Nebraska. Different bats, based on the habitats they use and the insects they eat, you can find them in different parts of the state. And so, yeah, these are all the species that you could potentially find here in Nebraska. And the reason for that, Nebraska is kind of interesting based on the standpoint of where it is situated geographically. So on the eastern half of the state, you'll get a lot of bats you find in the eastern half of the United States. And then some of these species sort of, you reach the edge of their range and then you start encountering your western US bats. So Nebraska lies at the edge of a lot of different species ranges. So this year here is an evening bat, and you can find this species. It's mostly in the eastern half of Nebraska, but you can find it throughout much of the Midwest and southern United States. We also have tricolored bats, which have a larger range, so you can find them into Central America, farther into the northern parts of North America, United States, into Canada. And so these guys and northern long-eared bats, which you can find up even further into Canada, both of these species have been hit particularly hard by white nose syndrome. So they're not as common. You don't find them, they're not as common throughout much of their range as they used to be. Tricolored bats are probably one of they really like to roost in caves. And so that's the reason behind why they've been hit so hard by white nose syndrome. But these are two species you mostly find in the eastern and northern parts of the state up by the Niobrara River. And same with the little brown bat. So these guys have also been hit hard by white nose syndrome. They actually cover most of North United States and up all the way to Alaska in Canada. And so these guys like to forage over ponds and creeks and streams and things like that. They like to forage on insects there. And so you can sort of find them along the fringes of Nebraska. So a lot of these bats, they like to roost in the summertime in trees and other wooden structures. So that's partially to explain why you don't really find them so much in central Nebraska, where there's a lot fewer trees for them to roost. Moving westward, we have the long-legged bat. So this is one species you really only find in the panhandle area of Nebraska, but you can find them through much of the West Coast, from Alaska to Mexico. So it's a lot of different environments that you can find this kind of bat. We also have fringe bats, which you can find even further into Central America. And then Western small-footed bats, which have a much smaller range where you can find them, but they also sort of you can find them in the panhandle area as well. Nebraska lies right at the edge also of the Townsend big-eared bat. So you can see that it's got very big ears. These guys really like to roost in caves, and they like to eat moths. but you can find them through much of Western United States into Mexico. And there's sort of two isolated populations that you can find in Central and Eastern United States. And that's where there's much more extensive cave systems. So these bats really like to roost in caves. And then there's a couple of bats that you can find through much of almost all of North America, except eastern red bats are, because of their namesake, they're mostly confined to the eastern half of the United States. But silver-haired bats, big brown bats are probably the species people encounter the most. These bats like to roost in man-made structures, attics, houses, that sort of thing. So that's the bat people usually see the most. Hoary bats are the biggest bat we have here in North America, and they are also the only native mammal to Hawaii. So I'm not really sure how they got out there, but they did, and it's just a interesting tidbit. But you can find these bats through all of Nebraska. And so the North American Bat Monitoring Program was established by researchers in, it's kind of a joint effort in Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And so the goal was to sort of standardize the surveying process to collect data on bats that you can find in all these countries, and sort of create a big national, international database by which the researchers would be able to monitor all these bats and monitor their activity, see if there are any species in decline, if any species expand their ranges, and things like that. So there's a lot of different agencies involved in the United States, and so each state sort of, not all states have implemented this program. And so prior to 2016, Nebraska didn't have one. So one of my colleagues started this program to make a bat monitoring program for Nebraska. And so the primary ways that we collect data for the North American Bat Monitoring Program is through acoustic detectors. So I touched on that the bats here in North America, they use these high frequency sounds to fly around at night. And so these units basically record those sounds that bats make if they fly close enough to them. So each of them has a microphone that picks up these really high frequency sounds. And so we have stationary units, so detectors who would put out and leave in one spot for a few days. And then there's also driving transects. So there are detectors where we can actually attach the microphone to the roof of a car and drive a pre-planned route. And then there are also colony counts. So areas where there are caves or where you'd find large gatherings of bats. People will go in there every year and do these cave surveys to see, if how many bats are coming back every year. See if there's any species or population declines that way. But here in Nebraska, we don't really have many of those. So we're primarily focusing on the stationary and mobile sampling methods. And so here in Nebraska, we've partnered with a few agencies. So Nebraska Game and Parks, I'm in the Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, and also School of Natural Resources. And so we've picked 35 different areas in the state that we sample. And yeah, these are the different organizations involved. And so the goals that what we're trying to do here in Nebraska is, monitor bat activity every year, see if there are any large scale changes. And then I mentioned how different Nebraska lies at the edge of different species ranges. So seeing if any species expand their range, or maybe the opposite happens. So those are two things we're looking for. Also, what sorts of habitat these different species of bats like to use. And then also getting the public involved. So that's where this project, part of the project, comes in. There's the goal of establishing citizen science monitoring efforts, and then just increasing public awareness about bats. So a lot of people don't think there are bats in Nebraska. I talked to several landowners. They didn't believe us, but there are bats here, and it's good to know about them. And so here in Nebraska, well, basically the international, the larger scale North American bat monitoring program, basically what they did was they chopped up North America into all these little 10 by 10 grid cells. They gave each of them a number based on how the importance it was, or the priority they wanted to give each cell to be sampled. So here in Nebraska, we basically picked the 35 highest ranked areas to sample. And so that's what all those little boxes are across the state. And so in each one, we've got 2 to 4 stationary detectors. So detectors we put out in one spot for like 4 nights or so. And we also have, each one is in a different habitat type. And then we also have the car driving transect that runs through each of these grids. And something that I'm coming to learn is that most of Nebraska is privately owned. So the vast majority of our sites are on private lands. There have been a lot of landowners who have been nice enough to grant us access to their property. And so it's very important to maintain that trust. Otherwise, most of these sites we wouldn't be able to sample. This sort of illustrates what our stationary detector setup looks like. So we basically mount this unit to the top of a pole and leave it out for about 4 nights of good weather. So if there's really high winds or if it's raining, bats aren't, all these bats are eating insects. So if it's really windy and rainy, the insects probably aren't going to be out. So the bats aren't really going to expend energy because they've got nothing to eat, really. So good weather is key. So we leave them out for about 4 nights. And if a bat flies close enough to the detector, we'll record them. And then this just illustrates the driving transect, which basically we're just doing the same thing, but driving a car. So there's a lot of different types of detectors out there that bat researchers use to record bats. These are a handful of them. But for this project, we predominantly have 2 detectors. The one on the left is NABat Express unit. So it's more of a passive sampling detector, and it records bats. It stores the information in the sonograph form, which is the image we see on the left. So each of those sort of lines is a different echolocation pulse that the bat has produced. And then on the right, we have an NABat walkabout unit, which is more of an active sampling approach. So you can actually see in real time and hear the sounds that the bats are making. They'll show up on the screen. And so it'll restore them both as a spectrogram and in sonograph form. So spectrogram, as you can see from the figure, it has more body to the call. There's more of the call that we can see there. So there's more information. It retains more of the information that bats make. So these are the 2 units that we use on this project. And so different bats will make different. So like, why are we record the sounds and then what? So different bats make different kinds of echolocation sounds. And then they also make different sounds based on what they're trying to do and the environment that they're in. So this is a good file. It has a number of different things that this particular bat is doing. So on the left, we have a search phase. So that's a bat that's flying around. It's gathering data. It's gathering information on its environment. You know, maybe looking for an insect. So it's just sort of flying around, just searching. And bats also can communicate with other bats with these echolocation calls. And so we call those social calls. And they have sort of this weird sinusoidal wave to them. They don't really look like the other calls that they produce. And then as bats approach objects, or maybe they've found an insect that they want to chase down, they've got these approach phase echolocation calls that they make. And then when they get really close to an insect where they're actually trying to catch it and eat it, there's sort of these really light, really fast frequency sounds they make that researchers call feeding buzzes. So that's when the bat's actually catching and eating the insects. And then it sort of goes back to its searching. So you can, if you get a good quality call, you can sort of tell roughly what the bat's trying to do. The other thing is that different species make different sorts of calls. But a lot of bats also make the same looking calls. So sometimes it gets really tricky to tell bats apart. So we can just from these two species, we've got a big brown bat and then a tricolored bat. So you would be able to tell the difference because the tricolored bat's calls they sort of have these bursts of sounds that they make, and they're also a lot more uniform than you would get with a big brown bat. So different bats have different calls that, so we have researchers and software programs that can help us process, because sometimes we get a lot of acoustic data if there's a lot of bat activity. And so there are different characteristics of calls that you can use to identify what bat species made that sounds. So I thought I'd include some results from the past few years. So the figure on the top left is all the stationary points from 2017, and then on the right is all the stationary points from 2018. So you can see that in terms of, so red indicates the highest levels of activity, and then blue would indicate the lowest. So you can see that there's sort of this gradient across Nebraska, where the further west you go, there's sort of less activity, but you also get different species. And just between the two different years, there was, more bats throughout more of the state, or more bat activity throughout more of the state in 2017 than in 2018. And so the figure on the bottom, all the blue icons are all the sites we sampled, but all the green highlight all the areas where our units recorded northern long-eared bats. So that's a threatened species that we're interested in. And so we can sort of monitor, where these species roughly occur in the state, and if that changes over the years. So these are the units, all the equipment that we use, and that we would lend to you guys, as needed for sampling whatever sites, if any of you guys are interested in doing so. So on the left, we have a bin with four of the stationary detectors, one of the driving transects, but also a GPS unit, so you can find out where you are, where you want to go. The car mounting equipment, batteries and chargers, and then also there is a little bit of habitat. vegetation that we're interested in. Not really so much identifying the plants, so you don't have to worry about that, but also a folder that contains information, about the sites, and we have data sheets and a binder that sort of gives step-by-step instructions in case maybe you forgot how to do something. So it sort of lays out everything that you would need to know. So these are some of the documents that are in those manila folders. So we've got the sites and the different site names, where each point is in that particular area, and then where you would start and end on the driving transect. And then a list of everything just that you should have, maybe stuff that's missing. And so just some to double check what you have or the equipment you need. Also an image of the site and coordinates for where that site is, the landowner information, because we don't really want to show up unannounced. I've been calling landowners, telling them, because each site we have roughly a time frame where we try to sample the same spots at around the same times, just to mitigate any biases. So I've told landowners when we're thinking of coming, but still we want to call when we're going out to the site, just so we don't look like sketchy people carrying game cameras and things like that. So all this stuff should be included. And in terms of setting up these equipment, so for people who will be interested in sampling, we can plan to go more in depth on how to actually operate the equipment and things like that. For this presentation, I thought I'd stick more just to the nature of the project, just to give a better idea of what we're trying to do. But basically, for the just an overview, the stationary units, we have these PVC pipes that we hammer into the ground that keep the pole standing up straight, but we can also lengthen or shorten the pole with those two black knobs on the upper left. So that's how we're able to lengthen the pole or shorten it. And then we mount the detector to the top of that. And so each detector basically, we can put an SD card in it. That's where it stores the information. And we just push the power button. And we use the night only setting because bats here in the United States are mostly nocturnal. So this unit will locate its satellite GPS on its own. And once it locks in on that, then it knows where it is and it knows when to turn on and turn off. So all we basically need to do is push the power button essentially, and then let the unit find itself. So this is an example of one of the data sheets that we would use for stationary detectors. So everything circled is basically just the site, the unit we're using, and where this detector is. Everything else has to deal with the habitat. So if there's water present, what kind of water it is, if there's a lot of vegetation, a lot of dense vegetation, and basically the distances to that vegetation is basically what we're interested in terms of habitat, just to get an idea of what's around. So this would be an example of dense habitat on the right versus not so much on the left. So we term this, bat researchers have a term for this, they call it clutter. So if it's a really dense vegetation, then there's a lot of clutter. So basically, if you put a detector in a highly cluttered area, so since bats, they're flying around using this echolocation, it's bouncing off of everything. So the more clutter it is, the more jumbled up acoustic sounds get, because there's so much more stuff that they're bouncing off of. So when that happens, it sort of degrades the call, and it's harder to tell what made that call. So we like to face the detectors, at least in areas of low clutter. But that's just one thing we would look for. And then in terms of driving transects, so we have these detectors, we have a cable in which we're able to attach to the microphone, which is usually when we're out with this sort of detector, the microphone is attached right to the unit. But we can also use an extension cable to attach the microphone and basically put it through this holster that we can suction cup to the top of the car. And then we can connect it to the detector, which we'd be holding on the inside of the car. And so we'd be able to, listen. You don't really want to drive and look at the detector, because it's basically like a tablet. But you can, there's a volume on it where you can listen, and if you get a bat, you can hear it, which is good and a little more exciting than putting out a detector and not knowing what happens until you come pick it up and actually look at the data. So you can sort of get a better idea of how you're doing, so to speak. And so these transects here in Nebraska, they're roughly 15 to 30 miles long, and we like to start around 45 minutes after sunset. So we do have all the routes. They're all pre-planned. And it's also tricky because we don't really want to drive too fast, because then we might miss some bats. But if we drive too slow and there's a bat circling around, we might pick it up twice. And the other thing with acoustics is you can't really tell apart individual bats. You can just sort of get a sense of, how active these bats are. So it could be one bat that's flying around, or it could be two. If they're different species, I mean, that helps differentiate them. But otherwise, we really don't have an idea of how many bats are out there. And so you can't keep the sound on to hear how you're doing. And something else I needed to add is, so I think Game and Park, I was talking with co-op or university people on this project. And so we would need, I think if you're Game and Parks, you should be all right. But we do have a defensive driving course online that we would need people to take just to make sure if somebody did get in accidents, that everyone's covered. And so there are data sheets for these mobile transects as well. Mostly there's no habitat involved because we're just driving on a road, but just what detector we're using, when we're starting, where we're starting, what time sunset is, because sunset changes all year round. And then just, a couple of rough estimates just on the weather. So like cloud cover, wind speed, things like that. So nothing too technical. And then this is a magnet that we can put to the back of your car. So, people, if you're driving 20 miles an hour on the road, people know that's what you're doing. Or we try to let them know what you're doing. And yeah, so that's just, the rough overview of what we're trying to do. Like I said, if people are interested, we can try to set up actual training, so how to actually use the equipment, familiarize with the data sheets and things like that. I do know that some of you have contacted me about sites that you're most interested in. So I have made notes of that. So I also have this for reference. These are all the different numbers of all the different cells and where they're located and the time frames for where we're ideally when we're looking to sample, but it's some field season, you never know what the weather is going to do. So good to be flexible. So yeah, if there's any questions.
So we've got one in the chat from Mark who wanted to know if there was just like a total bat population in the US. Is that kind of a known guesstimate?
I'm not sure. There are, I'm not sure. Like some species are more solitary than others. If you go down into Texas, you have the Brazilian three-tailed bats. They form the largest aggregations of mammals you'll find anywhere in the world. So they form these huge colonies and caves and bridges and stuff. So I don't know if there's, I'm not sure if there's a number of people have settled on for the United States, but
I was just interested in what percentage of the bats killed by windmills, what percentage is of the total population? Just like a rough estimate of how many bats are in the U.S.
right. Yeah, I'm not sure. I know so it does. Windmills don't really affect all bats similarly, much like white nose syndrome. So there are bats like the hoary bats, so the largest bat species we have here in the U.S. They will fly at higher altitudes than other bats, and some bats migrate, much like birds. They'll migrate south for the winter to find caves and things like that if there aren't caves, in Nebraska or other states. And so those bats are the ones that are affected most.
And Mark had another question about where white nose syndrome originated.
Yeah, so researchers first found it in a cave in New York back in 2006. And they've theorized that someone brought it over from Europe. So bat species in Europe, they don't really form the large colonies of bats that you'd find here in the United States. So there's people have theorized that that's one way that Europe bat numbers are sort of kept down. But yeah, that's where people think it originated from. So bats are pretty long lived for their size. Some bats can live over 30 years, but they reproduce very slowly. So they only have like one. Eastern red bats can have four pups a year, but most bats only have one or two. So while there are some bats that have sort of withstood white nose syndrome in the northeastern states, it's probably going to take a very long time, even just from like if white nose syndrome didn't do anything more, it would take a while for these bats to reach the population levels that they used to be. So white nose syndrome is pretty new to Nebraska. So part of my master's, we were catching northern long-eared bats. So they are still here. None of them had white nose syndrome that we saw. So we'll have to see what happens here.
Then Deanne asked if anybody's interested, should they just contact you directly? Interested in helping with the volunteering?
Yeah. So yeah, you can always reach me at my email. I don't know if there's like we want to do like a Master Naturalist interest chain or something. Maybe I can make one just so everyone is on the same page. I know not everyone interested was with Master Naturalists, so I talked to a few people who didn't really have an affiliation or game and parks. But I mean, yeah, you can always email me. So.
And we'll get we've sent your information out over our listserv, and we'll send it out again a couple more times. And when we post this video, all that information will be out there again. Dave Hansen asked if there's another reference sheet that better identifies the location of the test sites. So I'm wondering, if people are interested in adopting a cell, then you'd probably send them what the actual driving transect specific directions
Right.
look like.
Yeah, so I have more specific, site-specific details, coordinates for where all the points are. I sort of I need to do more research on maybe some sites on how to actually get there, because I was told there have been issues in the past where there's been some sort of trespassing issues. Just making sure that I've got all that up to date. But yeah, I do have these are just rough areas, just so people can sort of see, what areas they're closest to if they have an interest in a cell. But if I haven't discouraged you from this presentation, there's definitely more detailed site-specific information and locations that I can give.
Okay. I'm just going to go down the line with the chat here too a little bit. And so George asked about bat houses, about the ones that, you can answer this to the best of your knowledge, but do you think the bat houses that you see and they're sold in stores like Menards or Home Depot, Lowe's, do you think that those are effective? Do you think is there any data to back that up?
I personally don't know. I haven't worked much with bat houses, although I do know Bat Conservation International. So it's batcon.org. They do a lot of research on bat houses. They make their own bat houses. They give advice on how to make them, where to put them, what color to paint them, that sort of thing. But they also give you some instructions on how to build your own if you want to. But I'm not sure how that stacks up against ones that like other construction stores. Yeah,
I've heard differing things too, with pollinator, like bee hotels.
It is kind of tricky, I think, in order to first make bats aware that it's there. But once they know it's there and they've moved in, I think it's not smooth sailing, but I think that's probably the hardest part, is just trying to get them to know that it's there. And I know people who have put up bat houses and they can't get them in.
Yep.
So whether that's just what kind of bat house it is, if it's not warm enough or where it is, it's kind of tricky. But I do know that I personally know that Bat Conservation International does a lot of research on that.
And I might be wrong, but I want to say Nebraska Extension has a NEB guide on bat houses. I think they've got one on pollinator houses, like bee houses too. I have to double check. But Margaret asked then more about the volunteering. What is the estimated time commitment for stationary and mobile monitoring?
Right. Yeah. So different sites, some sites are right next to the road, which is great because you don't have to walk very far. Others are more remote, I guess you could say. And so the stationary detectors, we basically, put them up, leave them out there for 4 nights of good weather, and then you can pick them up. And so with the other coordinator, he left me a pamphlet, and I think it got sent. It was on the pamphlets that got sent out, but sort of what, like you don't really need to, you can minimize the amount of times you would need to visit the site. So you could put up the detector and then that night drive the transect, and then you don't have to do anything until you pick them up. Then you can pick them up and you can drive the transect. Yeah, or you can, I mean, you can also, recruit family members or friends, just as long as you know what you're doing. It's probably better, to go out with someone else than just doing all this by yourself. But yeah, there are ways to, so, maybe 2 days, and depending on, where the detector is, how long it takes to get there, would pretty much, dictate the time commitment.
Now, Dave was also asked about, is there any fungicides that can be used to help treat white nose syndrome?
Yeah, so there have been certain fungicides and chemicals that researchers have found. If they find bats that are suffering from white nose syndrome, and they sort of take them into their lab and they treat them, these bats recover. But there hasn't really been any sort of development in terms of widely applying these sorts of chemicals. So researchers, they're sort of hesitant to like fog an entire cave because there are tons of different kinds of fungicides out there, or fungi. And so there are also a lot of good fungi, and undoubtedly in caves. And so they don't really know what the repercussions of that will do. Some fungi have really similar DNA to just regular tissue. So there are some, so sort of gets tricky to kill them, kind of like cancer, but there have been some chemicals and applications that have helped bats that are suffering from white nose syndrome to recover, but no real way to sort of mass apply it. Researchers are hopeful that bats that have withstood this disease, back where they initially found it, have developed sort of a resistance to it. And so there is sort of hope that way as well. But a lot more bats are still going to die before something's found. So we just try to minimize spreading it. So bats just roost in the same caves every winter, so they'll roost in a different cave and bring the fungus to that bat, or people who go into caves and go in multiple different kinds of caves, they'll also spread it. So we try to minimize the caves we go into. We do decontaminate. If we're catching bats, we decontaminate our equipment every time, just to minimize humans spreading that fungus as well. So
Well, I had more like kind of a technical question. With the data loggers, what's kind of the range on those, and can they pick up more than one individual bat at a time?
yeah, so some files you'll get a couple bats at once. You get those social calls, so you get a couple bats talking to each other. So it's tricky. It takes a while to master identifying bat calls, like just as a person, just by looking at it. And so if you're going through a whole summer's worth of data across the state, there are software programs that are out there to sort of help facilitate that. And so that's good in that they're able to process more files and they're more consistent, but they're not 100%. And there are more things than bats that you can pick up. So if you leave your detector out and it rains, you'll just get all the noise from the rain. If you have really high winds, also insects. If you're in a wooded area and there are a lot of insects buzzing around, cicadas, all those sorts of things, they all make loud noises and will show up. Usually they our software, usually a lot of insects get labeled as hoary bat calls. So those are our biggest, because these bats have such a low register that they will echolocate at. And they also have more raggedy looking calls. So a lot of times insects will get mistaken as hoary bats. So it does get tricky. Researchers have found other animals that make high frequency sounds. Apparently there are mice in the southwestern United States. The males will sing at a really high frequency to attract females. And they get picked up on bat recorders. So yeah, sometimes there's no telling what you're getting, but you can tell it's probably not a bat.
I've just heard anecdotally from master naturalists who have helped out in years past how cool it is when you're driving the Transect to see them come in.
Also, if you so along those lines, if you so this affects all detectors, but you can hear it on those when you're driving the Transects. If you get too close to power lines, you've got all that current running through the wires. That also makes a loud buzzing noise on the detector. So it sort of drowns out anything else that's out there. Basically, it picks up the loudest noise. So if you have an insect or a frog that's sitting on the detector and singing all night, even if a bat does fly close enough, if the insect's louder than the bat, it's not really going to pick up the bat. So it gets tricky.
Well, we've got a couple more minutes left. We've got some people who are interested. And so Mark asked, and this is something we were talking about before we let anybody into the call, but he was asking if there's going to be, like a group training for those who want to volunteer. And I would say TBD at the moment. We can see what kind of interest we get. Send out to Chris, because it depends on, I'm not going to speak for you, but I'm just saying it probably just depends on your availability and your time frame. If it would be easier to do individual trainings, or we could also send something out too.
Yeah, it might help if maybe if we send out one email and maybe everyone reply to that email if they're interested. Okay. So like that would be one spot, and then we know the number of people, maybe where people are, and then we can sort of get a place that's or different. We can have multiple training sessions, but as long as it's before May 24th. So I'm pretty flexible. Yeah, late May is usually when we start.
Okay.
Right now, I've sent most of my detectors in to get their checkup, just to make sure everything's operating. So I should be getting those back soon. But yeah, that might be the best way. Just if we send out an email and then everyone sort of reply who's definitely interested. Maybe the cells again that you're interested in. Just so we have all that in one place, and then we can decide on a time and a place to show how to actually use the equipment.
Awesome. Well, I think we've reached our time for today. Thanks, Chris, for giving us an hour of your time and explaining all this to us. And we hope to get some master naturalists out to help you. And so I'll follow up. This will be posted up on our YouTube page later today, and then we'll also email out all of our master naturalists that link, and then also just an interest and see if we can get people together for a group training, and then in about a week or so after that, gauge interest and identify a training location and a date. And that we kind of just go from there. But if you guys have any other questions, you can email them to me, and then we'll also put Chris's email address will also be in the follow-up information if you want to contact him directly. But thanks, Chris, for your time today. Yeah, I mean, alternatively, like if we can't decide, or if that doesn't make sense, maybe to have one training session, then going to people's houses and doing it that way, will also work. So yeah, no problem. Thanks everyone for coming and expressing interest. So there's a lot of sites here. So